Think about the last time you had to navigate a tricky social situation, maybe at work, or even within your own family. Now, imagine that same delicate dance, but with far higher stakes, where one wrong move could cost you not just your job, but your life. This was the daily reality for medieval servants, the invisible hands that kept castles running and kings in power. While history books often focus on crowned heads and epic battles, the true masters of survival were those who moved silently through the shadows, reading the unspoken rules of court intrigue like a secret language. Their stories are rarely told, yet they hold some of the most fascinating lessons about human resilience and cunning. Picture this: a servant enters a royal chamber, their eyes downcast, their hands steady as they pour wine. To an outsider, it's just another mundane task, but in that moment, they're deciphering a web of alliances and threats, catching the flicker of a noble's eye, the subtle shift in a queen's posture, the way a lord lingers just a second too long near a private letter. These weren't just men and women doing chores. They were experts in the art of silent communication, using coded gestures, hidden symbols, and even the way they arranged a banquet table to send messages. Their survival depended on noticing what others missed, and their influence often shaped the fate of empires. What makes their stories so compelling isn't just the drama of court life, it's how eerily familiar their strategies feel today. The way they navigated power, the alliances they forged in secret, even the quiet rebellions they staged, all of it mirrors the unspoken rules we still grapple with in our own lives. Over the next few minutes, we'll step into their world, uncovering the ingenious codes they use to outwit the powerful and protect themselves. You'll discover how a dropped handkerchief could signal danger, why the placement of a candle might reveal a plot, and how servants turned their invisibility into their greatest weapon. This isn't just history, it's a masterclass in reading between the lines, taught by the people who wrote the rules. So let's pull back the tapestry and reveal the hidden world of medieval servants, where every silence spoke volumes. If you were a servant in a medieval castle, your entire life depended on one thing: where you stood in the invisible ladder of power. At the top were figures like the chamberlain, the lord's right hand, who held keys to locked chests and private chambers. They moved through the castle with quiet authority, their ears catching whispers of rebellion or romance long before anyone else. But this access came at a price. One misplaced word, one moment of carelessness, and they could tumble from favor into disgrace, or worse. Then there were mid-tier servants like the lady's maid, who dressed her mistress each morning and undressed her at night, weaving hair into braids while unraveling secrets. They were confidantes, spies, and sometimes even pawns in noble feuds, walking a tightrope between loyalty and self-preservation. Down in the kitchens and stables, life was different but no less strategic. A scullion scrubbing pots might seem insignificant, but they overheard cooks gossiping about which noble refused a dish, a clue to poisoning fears. Stable boys noticed which lords rode out alone at night, hinting at secret meetings. Even the lowliest servants were links in an unbroken chain of information, each with their own way to trade whispers for favors or protection. What's fascinating is how these roles shaped the secret codes of the castle. High-ranking servants developed subtle gestures, a tap of a goblet, a fold in a napkin, to warn allies without speaking. Lower servants relied on cruder but equally effective signs: a broom left leaning against a wall, a stable door left ajar. Every role had its own survival toolkit, tailored to its place in the hierarchy. This wasn't just about staying alive, it was about carving out agency in a world designed to erase you. A clever chamberlain might misplace a damning letter to protect a patron. A kitchen maid could accidentally burn a meal meant for a rival family. Servants turned their invisibility into influence, using their positions to nudge events without leaving fingerprints. And when tensions boiled over, the nobility often learned too late that the quietest hands held the most power. After all, who better to start a revolt than the people who knew every secret passage and sleeping guard's schedule? The castle's hierarchy wasn't just a system of labor, it was a battlefield of silent alliances where the rules were written in glances, not decrees. But how did servants communicate when walls had ears? That's where language itself became a weapon, and our next stop in this hidden world. The most powerful messages in a medieval court were often the ones never spoken aloud. Imagine passing a life or death warning while surrounded by enemies, without making a sound. Servants perfected this delicate art, turning everyday objects and actions into a secret vocabulary. A goblet placed slightly to the left of a guest's hand might mean, "Trust no one at this table," while a napkin folded into sharp corners could signal an impending arrest. Even the timing of routine tasks held meaning. A maid lingering an extra moment while lighting candles near a noble's chair wasn't being slow. She was buying time for her mistress to hide a compromising letter. Some of the most ingenious codes were hiding in plain sight. Take something as simple as a banquet. The way dishes were arranged on a platter, meat slices fanned clockwise versus counterclockwise, could indicate which allies were safe to approach. Servants scrubbing floors used patterns in the whetstones to mark escape routes during coups. Stable hands tied horses' reins in specific knots to warn riders of ambushes ahead. These weren't random acts, they were carefully designed systems passed down through generations of servants like a silent inheritance. But the true genius lay in how these signals evolved. When a code became too widely known, servants adapted instantly. After a notorious incident where a spilled wine goblet betrayed a plot, clever staff switched to subtler methods like adjusting the angle of a chair or leaving a single flower petal on a pillow. The nobility rarely caught on, dismissing such details as mere accidents. That was the servants' ultimate advantage. Their invisibility let them rewrite the rules of communication under the noses of the powerful. Perhaps the most heartbreaking codes were those used to protect fellow servants. A laundress might stitch a tiny red thread into the hem of a co-worker's dress, a warning that the wearer was being blackmailed. Kitchen boys left bread crusts in particular shapes to alert others to abusive overseers. These quiet acts of solidarity reveal a hidden network of care woven into the fabric of castle life, proving that even in a world designed to isolate them, servants found ways to watch each other's backs. What's remarkable is how these silent strategies blurred the line between submission and control. A servant who accidentally dropped a tray during a private meeting wasn't just clumsy, they were buying their lord time to compose himself after shocking news. The same hands that appeared to serve were often subtly steering events, using their mastery of unspoken language to influence outcomes without ever seeming to interfere. In a world where speech could mean death, silence became their superpower and their most devastating weapon. Consider the humble act of folding laundry, something so ordinary, so forgettable that no noble would think twice about it. Yet in the hands of a skilled servant, a pile of linens could become a masterpiece of hidden meaning. A sleeve folded inward instead of outward might warn of a spy in the household. A handkerchief deliberately left unfolded could signal that a private meeting had been overheard. Even the number of pleats in a skirt carried significance. 3 pleats for danger, 5 for safety, 7 for speak only in the gardens after dark. These weren't random choices, they were part of an intricate language developed over generations where every tuck and fold could save a life. Flowers held even more potent secrets. While nobles admired bouquets for their beauty, servants used them as living message boards. A sprig of rosemary placed at the center of an arrangement wasn't just decoration, it was a warning that someone's drink might be poisoned. Lavender tucked beside a guest's plate hinted at hidden alliances, while a single wilted petal on a windowsill marked a room where conversations were being monitored. Gardeners became codemasters, carefully selecting and positioning plants to send signals only their allies would understand, a bed of sage planted in a perfect circle. That meant trust no one this week. The beauty of these systems was their deniability if questioned. A servant could always claim they were simply following aesthetic preferences. Meal deliveries operated on equally precise timing. Bringing a lord's breakfast precisely at sunrise was routine, but delivering it 15 minutes early. That was an emergency alert, often signaling that search warrants had been issued or that hostile forces were approaching the gates. The clatter of dishes in the hallway wasn't just noise, specific sequences of sounds functioned as auditory codes. 3 quick knocks followed by 2 slow ones when entering with wine meant, "The person you feared has arrived." Servants transformed their entire workflow into a symphony of subtle warnings, where every clang of a pot or scrape of a chair leg could carry vital information. But how did this secret knowledge spread without written manuals or formal training? That's where the true brilliance of servant networks shone. New hires learned through carefully staged mistakes. A senior maid might accidentally fold a shirt the wrong way in front of them, then watch for recognition in their eyes. Kitchen apprentices were tested with seemingly innocent questions like, "Does the rosemary need more sunlight?" Their answer revealing whether they understood the plant's coded meaning. These teachings happened in stolen moments, during pre-dawn bread baking, while mending clothes by candlelight, or through songs whose lyrics contained hidden instructions. The systems were designed to be invisible to outsiders, yet instantly recognizable to those in the know, a survival mechanism refined through centuries of necessity. What's astonishing is how these networks crossed castle walls. Market days became intelligence-gathering operations, where servants from rival households exchanged news disguised as gossip about vegetable prices. Pilgrimages to nearby shrines provided cover for emergency meetings. Even something as simple as a shared bucket at the well could become a drop point for folded notes hidden under the water's surface. This web of connections stretched across kingdoms, proving that while nobles waged wars with swords, servants conducted their diplomacy through bunches of thyme and strategically creased napkins, their quiet rebellion written not in ink, but in the fabric of everyday life. The true strength of servant networks wasn't just in their codes, it was in their people. A new scullery maid arriving at a castle might think she was alone, but within days she'd be approached with a test. Perhaps an older laundress would accidentally drop a bundle of sheets near her, watching to see if the newcomer rushed to help fold them in the traditional pattern, a silent way to ask, "Are you one of us?" Passing these unspoken trials granted access to a shadow family that crossed bloodlines and borders. Veteran servants became surrogate parents, teaching rookies how to spot a noble's lie by the way they tapped their fingers, or which stare creaked loudest when someone approached unseen. This knowledge wasn't given freely, it was earned through acts of quiet bravery, like smuggling an extra loaf to a servant in the stocks or covering for a co-worker caught listening at doors. Traveling figures became lifelines between these isolated cells of resistance. A minstrel tuning his lute by the fire wasn't just entertaining, he was murmuring lyrics that contained updates from a castle 3 valleys away. Merchants' carts hid compartments beneath silks and spices, carrying folded notes written in lemon juice that would only appear when held to a candle. Even pilgrims carried secrets, stitching tiny symbols into their robes to indicate which noble houses were recruiting assassins or which roads were unsafe. The genius of these systems was their flexibility. A baker in Normandy might use a different bread scoring pattern than one in Burgundy to indicate danger, but the underlying principle remained: trust no one who doesn't know the local signs. Yet for all their cunning, these networks lived on a knife's edge. A single captured messenger could unravel years of careful alliances under torture, which is why the most critical messages were never written or spoken. Instead, servants relied on memory chains, where information was broken into pieces and carried by multiple couriers. One might know only a place, another a time, a third a face, meaning no single person held enough to betray the whole. Loyalty was enforced not through threats, but through bonds forged in shared vulnerability. When a lord's temper flared, it was servants who smuggled bandages to the whipped. When winter stores ran low, they redistributed scraps to the weakest among them. Their greatest weapon wasn't secrecy, it was solidarity. And then there were the eavesdroppers. While nobles dismissed servants as part of the furniture, those invisible hands were absorbing every whispered plot and drunken confession. A page polishing armor near an open window might memorize troop movements discussed inside. A chambermaid shaking out bedsheets could catch fragments of a treasonous letter discarded in the rushes. But gathering information was only half the battle. The real skill was in knowing what to do with it. A wise servant never acted on secrets directly. Instead, they might accidentally leave a door ajar so a rival lord's spy could overhear damaging gossip, letting others do the dangerous work of exposure. The most successful eavesdroppers weren't just listeners, they were puppet masters, pulling strings so subtly that nobles never realized who truly held the reins. What made these networks so formidable was their sheer unpredictability. A noble might bribe a steward for information, only to receive carefully crafted lies fed by the servant collective. A queen's favorite maid, seemingly devoted, could be funneling secrets to the kitchen boy who passed them to a gardener who then shaped the palace's rose bushes into patterns that warned neighboring castles. The higher-ups assumed servants were too uneducated to organize, never grasping that their inferiors had built a shadow government right under their noses. And when revolution finally came to a kingdom, it was often these invisible networks that decided which nobles kept their heads and which found their secrets spilled like blood on the executioner's block. But eavesdropping was just the beginning. The real art lay in turning overheard whispers into action without ever letting the powerful know you were pulling the strings. Eavesdropping wasn't just a skill for medieval servants, it was their lifeline. Imagine standing motionless behind a tapestry, your breath shallow, as nobles debated rebellion just inches away. One slip, a rustle of fabric, a misplaced cough could mean a trip to the dungeon. Yet the rewards were worth the risk. A maid overhearing a lord's secret affair might trade silence for extra fire would come winter. A butler catching wind of a plot against the king could exchange his knowledge for a promotion or at least a guarantee his family wouldn't starve. Information was currency, and servants became expert bankers of whispered words. The best eavesdroppers mastered the art of becoming part of the scenery. They knew which shadows in the great hall swallowed movement whole, which alcoves near the chapel amplified voices from the confessional. Some even learned to control their own bodily reactions, no flinching when shocking secrets spilled, no widening of eyes at mentions of treason. Their faces became masks of blank obedience, even as their minds catalogued every damning detail. This wasn't passive listening, it was a high-stakes performance where the audience never realized they were being watched. Selective hearing took this game to another level. A servant might accidentally knock over a pitcher when dangerous topics arose, creating chaos to mask their presence. Others developed tricks to feign ignorance, repeating back only harmless fragments of conversations when pressed, as if their ears couldn't grasp complex plots. The cleverest ones even planted false narratives, pretending to misunderstand what they'd heard to steer suspicions away from themselves. "Oh no, my lord, I thought you said you were dining with the bishop, not conspiring with him." This delicate dance of pretending to hear less than you did while actually hearing far more required nerves of steel, but knowledge was only power if used wisely. Savvy servants never acted on information directly. Instead, they let secrets slip to third parties, maybe a visiting merchant who'd spread rumors in the next town, or a rival noble's servant who'd carry the tale upstairs. This created layers of deniability. By the time a scandal reached the earl's ears, its origin was untraceable. Some servants took it further, using overheard threats to anonymously protect potential victims, leaving unsigned notes in prayer books, or altering the castle's cleaning schedule to keep targets away from danger zones. The true masters of this craft didn't just collect secrets, they weaponized timing. A servant might hold onto a damaging piece of gossip for months, waiting for the perfect moment to let it surface. Perhaps when their abusive overseer was already in disgrace, or when the castle's food stores ran dangerously low, making lords more likely to bargain. These weren't reckless informants, they were strategists playing long games, understanding that information expired like milk, useless unless used at just the right moment. Punishment for getting caught could be brutal, but servants developed countermeasures. Many worked in pairs, one to listen, another to keep watch for approaching footsteps. Some devised emergency signals, like dropping a specific hymn during chapel cleaning to warn others the Lord's guard was coming. The most vulnerable children running messages between chambers were taught innocent-looking codes, like scratching their ear if questioned or humming a particular tune when passing a risky corridor. Every layer of deception was about survival, turning the castle's very architecture into an instrument of silent resistance. What's astonishing is how these invisible acts shifted real power. A servant who knew where the Lord hid his gold could suggest better wages by casually mentioning how easily thieves might find it. A kitchen boy overhearing plans to reduce staff might accidentally burn that night's bread, reminding nobles how much they relied on skilled hands. Servants didn't just witness history, they shaped it from the shadows, using their ears as finely tuned tools of influence. And when revolutions eventually toppled thrones across Europe, it was often these overlooked observers who decided which whispered secrets would finally see the light and which would die with them. The greatest power a servant could wield wasn't strength or charm, it was the ability to vanish in plain sight. Picture a scribe bent over his parchment, shoulders hunched, fingers stained with ink. To the nobles striding past, he was just another piece of furniture, as noteworthy as a chair or a candlestick. But in that moment of perceived insignificance, his quill might be softening a harsh sentence in a legal decree, or adding a single loop to a letter that changed an inheritance. The same principle applied to the laundress humming as she scrubbed stains from linen her hands could accidentally let a damning love letter flutter into the fire, altering the course of a political alliance without anyone suspecting her role. This invisibility wasn't just luck, it was a carefully cultivated performance. Servants mastered the art of moving through spaces without leaving a ripple, keeping their gazes lowered just enough to avoid eye contact, their footsteps light enough to blend into the background noise of the castle. They knew precisely how to make their presence forgettable, the right level of deference in their posture, the perfect tone of voice that neither challenged nor lingered in memory. Some even practiced breathing techniques to minimize sound when eavesdropping, or learned to time their movements to coincide with the clatter of dishes or the rustling of tapestries. But this shield of anonymity had cracks. Push too far, alter one too many documents, lose one too many letters, and suspicion would ignite. A noble might not notice a single missing spoon, but a pattern of vanished silverware would eventually catch attention. Servants walked a razor's edge, constantly gauging how much they could influence events before their invisibility wore thin. The wisest ones acted like gardeners pruning a vine, a subtle snip here, a gentle redirect there, never drawing attention to the hand guiding the growth. The tension between loyalty and self-preservation played out in countless small choices. A maid might genuinely care for her lady, yet still hide a scrap of bread in her sleeve, knowing the noble family would let servants starve before touching their own reserves. A stable hand could adore the horses he tended, yet still loosen a single strap on a cruel knight's saddle, trusting the man's poor riding skills to do the rest. These weren't acts of outright rebellion, they were calibrated corrections, tiny adjustments to balance the scales of power without ever tipping them overtly. What's fascinating is how servants developed instincts for when to act and when to vanish completely. During a political crisis, the smartest ones made themselves utterly indispensable, fetching wine before it was requested, anticipating every need, while simultaneously erasing any trace of their own opinions. They became like shadows at midday, present but unnoticed, essential but unremembered. Yet the moment danger passed, those same servants might stumble while carrying a tray near visiting diplomats, creating just enough chaos to overhear reactions and gauge alliances. Their ability to toggle between visibility and obscurity was a survival skill as refined as any knight's swordplay. The true test came when loyalty to fellow servants clashed with self-preservation. Say a kitchen boy was caught stealing food to feed his sick mother. A fellow servant might step forward to take blame, risking a whipping to protect someone lower in the hierarchy. Other times, silence was the only option, even as it burned like poison. These impossible choices reveal the brutal calculus of servant life, when to stand together, when to scatter apart, and how to live with the consequences either way. Theirs was a world where morality bent like reeds in the wind, not out of weakness but because breaking meant annihilation. And then there were the servants who weaponized their supposed ignorance. A groom might wide-eyed ask a noble to explain battle tactics, drawing out secrets under the guise of admiration. A seamstress could misunderstand instructions, delivering a slightly altered garment that made its wearer look foolish at a critical moment. By leaning into stereotypes of servile simplicity, they turned underestimation into an offensive tool. The nobility never suspected the depth of strategy behind those downcast eyes, which was exactly how the servants preferred it. But even the most skilled practitioners of invisibility faced moments when the mask slipped. Maybe a lord caught a flicker of intelligence in a servant's gaze, or a lady noticed how quickly a clumsy maid moved when truly threatened. Those were the heart-stopping instants that separated the master players from the doomed. Surviving them required yet another layer of artistry, the ability to redirect attention with a well-timed spill, a faked coughing fit, or even a carefully planted rumor about another servant. The game never ended, it only changed shape with each passing hour. What's remarkable is how these ancient strategies echo in our modern world. From the barrister who hears corporate secrets while refilling coffee cups, to the IT technician who could access every email but chooses only to fix the printer, the dance between visibility and influence continues. Medieval servants remind us that power isn't always about who holds the crown. Sometimes it's about who holds the keys, the pens, and the silence, and knows precisely when to use them. Loyalty in a medieval castle wasn't given, it was bargained for, often with trembling hands and a knife at your back. Take the case of a trusted steward who'd served his lord for 20 years. One morning, he might overhear his master plotting treason and face an impossible choice: report it and risk being silenced as a witness, or stay silent and hang alongside the traitors when the king's men came. Servants lived in this grey zone where oaths sworn on holy relics collided with the primal instinct to survive. Some, like Marjorie Germain, became masters of the double game, feeding information to rival factions while maintaining a mask of perfect devotion. Her downfall came not because she was careless, but because the nobles she played against changed the rules mid-game, turning her from asset to liability overnight. The punishments for betrayal were as creative as they were brutal. A servant caught stealing might lose a hand, but one caught spying could expect far worse. Whipping was just the beginning. Some lords preferred psychological torture, forcing disloyal servants to wear weighted bells that chimed with every step, marking them as traitors for life. Others employed the dreaded knight's justice, where accused servants were given mock trials presided over by drunken nobles, their fates decided between courses of a feast. The most cunning punishments exploited a servant's very skills against them. A scribe who altered documents might have his fingers broken one by one. A talkative maid could find her tongue nailed to the castle gates. These weren't just penalties, they were performances designed to remind every watching servant of the cost of defiance. Yet even in this brutal system, servants found ways to twist the rules. A cook sentenced to the stocks for spoiling a meal might have allies slip him herbs to numb the pain. A messenger facing execution could recite coded last words that sent warnings rippling through the servant network. Some even turned their punishments into weapons, like the laundress who, after being branded, deliberately let her wound infect the noble family's linens. The castle's cruelty bred ingenuity, forcing servants to develop contingency plans for every disaster. They memorized secret routes to sanctuary churches, kept hidden stashes of coins sewn into mattress straw, and taught their children which monks could be bribed to fake burial records if they needed to disappear. What's chilling is how these dynamics created a shadow economy of betrayal. A lord's favorite valet might suddenly discover treasonous letters, not out of loyalty, but because a rival lord's chamberlain promised his family safe passage out of a war zone. Young servants were particularly vulnerable, often coerced into spying on their elders with threats against their parents. The castle's underbelly thrived on these chain reactions of fear, where today's informant could become tomorrow's scapegoat. But the wisest servants understood one unshakable truth: nobles would always protect their own first. That moment when a lord threw a faithful servant to the wolves to save his skin. That was the real education, a lesson written not in ink but in blood. The true survivor wasn't the servant who never got caught. It was the one who ensured someone else looked guiltier when disaster struck. A chambermaid might plant another woman's hairpin near stolen jewelry. A stable boy could accidentally leave a rival's knife near a murdered guard. This wasn't just self-preservation. It was a grim art form where the difference between life and death hinged on anticipating blame before it landed. Servants became experts in reading the castle's shifting winds, knowing when to stand firm, when to flee, and when to gently nudge suspicion toward a more expendable target. And then there were the rare moments when servants turned the tables entirely. Records tell of a castle where the entire staff vanished overnight after years of abuse, not in revolt but in perfect silence. They took nothing but their knowledge, how to light the Lord's fire without smoke, where the winter apple stores were buried, which stair would collapse if stepped on just so. Left behind were bewildered nobles suddenly realizing their power had always been borrowed, that the true keepers of the castle's secrets had walked away, leaving them stumbling through their own home like blind men in a maze. Gender carved distinct paths through the treacherous landscape of castle service paths, lined with both hidden advantages and unique dangers. A lady's maid might glide through chambers a male servant couldn't enter, her sewing basket hiding pilfered letters between skeins of thread. Yet that same access made her a target. When noblewomen schemed, their maids often became pawns forced to carry compromising messages or take blame for misplaced jewelry. Men faced different traps. A groom overhearing knights' drunken boasts could be pressured into joining their plots, while a steward managing finances might be coerced into falsifying records under threat of exposing his peasant family's stolen noble lineage. The castle's hierarchy exploited gender roles ruthlessly. Women were assumed to be gossips, men presumed to be brute stereotypes servants learned to weaponize. Pregnancy was one of the most perilous tightropes. A laundress carrying a noble's child might suddenly fall down the stairs, while a kitchen maid bearing a fellow servant's baby could lose her position entirely. Yet some women turned maternity into leverage. The legendary case of Alice Perrers, a servant who became Edward III's mistress, shows how calculated fertility could be. After bearing the king's child, she secured lands and titles most nobles never attained. More often, survival meant concealment. Midwives in servant networks developed herbal remedies to restore monthly courses, while others arranged discreet adoptions through faraway monasteries. These weren't just personal crises, they were power struggles where a swelling belly could be a death sentence or a bargaining chip. Men navigated their own gendered traps. Young pages faced relentless hazing, their initiations often crossing into abuse. Those who resisted risked being labeled cowards, while those who participated too eagerly became entangled in compromising alliances. Older male servants battled assumptions about violence. A blacksmith accused of striking a noble might have his hands crushed before any evidence was heard. Yet physical strength also offered protection. A broad-shouldered steward could intimidate corrupt bailiffs inspecting grain stores, while a butcher's skill with knives made him a dangerous target for false accusations. Some even cultivated fearsome reputations deliberately, like the Welsh stablemaster who encouraged rumors he'd been a battlefield surgeon, letting nobles imagine what those steady hands could do in the dark. Clothing became a secret language in this gendered dance. Women used apron ties to signal distress. A knot at the left hip meant "follow me quietly," while a right-sided bow warned danger ahead. Men developed their own systems, like the way a belt's length could indicate which lords were recruiting spies. Servants also exploited noble vanity. A seamstress might leave a dress slightly too tight, ensuring the wearer's discomfort distracted her during delicate negotiations. A valet could forget to polish a lord's ceremonial dagger, making him appear slovenly at critical moments. These tiny acts of sabotage weren't just revenge, they were calculated adjustments to the balance of power. The greatest gender divide emerged in escape routes. Women often fled into marriages arranged by servant networks, their new identities cemented by forged dowry papers. Men more frequently took to roads as traveling laborers or pretended madness, a dangerous gambit, but one that could exploit noble superstitions. Both strategies reveal the heartbreaking ingenuity of people rewriting their lives in the margins. A cook's daughter might become a widow overnight with the help of a bribed priest, while a stable boy could disappear into a monastery's scriptorium, his rough hands learning to illuminate manuscripts instead of break horses. What united them all was the understanding that survival wasn't about dignity, it was about adaptability. A pregnant maid swallowing her pride to beg protection from the very noble who assaulted her. A scribe biting his tongue as his life's work was credited to a lord's idiot son. These weren't failures of courage, but masterclasses in playing the long game. The castle stones were soaked with the sweat of servants who bent so they wouldn't break, their stories whispering a timeless lesson. Sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply enduring. For women in medieval service, every corridor held potential danger. A maid lighting candles in a nobleman's chamber might feel his gaze linger too long, knowing refusal could mean accusations of theft or worse, witchcraft. Many perfected what historians call respectable invisibility, wrapping themselves in the armor of piety. They'd clutch rosaries conspicuously, hum hymns while scrubbing floors, and volunteer for extra chapel cleaning. These weren't just acts of devotion, they were calculated shields. A woman seen praying at dawn was harder to accuse of midnight witchcraft. A seamstress who stitched crosses into every hem became untouchable, her piety a barrier against unwanted hands. Yet even these strategies had limits. When a noble's son claimed a kitchen girl had seduced him, her fate often hinged on the servant's silent network. Older women might testify they'd seen her leaving midnight masses, while laundresses would suddenly recall the purity of her undergarments, subtle codes implying virtue. Some went further, like the Canterbury case where servants smuggled an accused girl into a nunnery, then staged her miraculous healing of a noble's sick child to rewrite her reputation. These weren't just rescues, they were elaborate performances where survival depended on convincing storytelling. Men faced different traps. A squire pressured into delivering a challenge for his lord's dual refusal meant disgrace, but participation might end in his own death as a proxy fighter. Many developed avoidance tactics, forgetting messages, feigning illness before tournaments, or cultivating reputations as terrible fighters so nobles wouldn't risk them in contests. Drinking clubs became covert warning systems. What looked like raucous tavern gatherings were actually information exchanges, with specific toast patterns signaling which lords were recruiting for dangerous schemes. A mug slammed twice meant avoid the stables tonight. Ale spilled clockwise warned of incoming tax collectors. The herbal knowledge passed between women was particularly sophisticated. A tincture of henbane could make hands tremble just enough to accidentally spill wine on an aggressor's lap. Certain flower arrangements near bedchambers induced headaches, giving maids excuses to avoid nighttime summons. One surviving manuscript from a French castle even details how servants used diluted wolfsbane to induce temporary hoarseness, perfect for feigning illness when ordered to testify falsely. These remedies weren't just medicine, they were finely tuned instruments of self-defense. Religious spaces became sanctuaries in unexpected ways. Women invented prayer partnerships, where paired servants would interrupt each other's devotions at prearranged times, a system that prevented isolated encounters with predatory nobles. Men exploited confessionals, using the booth's privacy to whisper warnings to allied priests who'd then deliver coded sermons. Even pilgrimages served dual purposes. The scallop shells brought back from Compostela weren't just souvenirs, they could be ground into powders that caused harmless but convincing rashes, ideal for avoiding undesirable assignments. The cruelest irony was how the castle's power structure turned gender roles against servants. A noblewoman might protect her maid from male advances only to later punish her for tempting her husband. Stablemasters who resisted brawls were called cowards, while those who fought too well were suspected of peasant uprisings. Survival required constant recalibration, knowing when to lean into stereotypes and when to subvert them. A groom might play the simpleton to avoid political entanglements, then suddenly discover unexpected literacy to authenticate a life-saving document. These gendered strategies reveal servitude's deepest paradox. The more invisible you became, the more power you could wield. A laundress who knew which herbs stained sheets with miraculous, holy images could engineer a noble family's rise or downfall. A scribe with terrible eyesight might be ignored during secret meetings, only to later transcribe every word from memory. The castle's hierarchy assumed women were too meek and men too brutish to strategize, an underestimation servants exploited daily. Their greatest weapon wasn't strength or charm, but the nobles' unshakable belief that servants couldn't possibly outthink them. Yet for all their ingenuity, servants never forgot the stakes. The same herbs that induced protective rashes could, in stronger doses, kill a line few crossed lightly. The fake drunkenness that excused a man from violence might later cost him wages when the harvest failed. Every tactic balanced immediate safety against future peril. Every alliance came with unspoken debts. This was survival measured not in years, but in precarious moments, a relentless calculus where the smallest miscalculation could erase a lifetime of careful maneuvering. And then there were the servants who turned to a higher power for protection, not just as performance, but as profound strategy. Because when human alliances failed, divine intervention became the ultimate ace up a servant's sleeve. Religion wasn't just a spiritual refuge for medieval servants, it was a tactical tool, sharpened to a fine point. Take something as simple as a rosary. While nobles might see it as a sign of piety, servants knew those beads could mark them as trustworthy to certain factions, or, if tucked away too quickly, signal hidden alliances. Prayer books became more than devotional objects. Their margins held tiny, coded notes, the sacred text itself masking treasonous whispers. Even the rhythm of recited psalms carried meaning. Speeding through certain verses could warn of eavesdroppers, while dragging out others might confirm a meeting place. The chapel wasn't just for worship. It was the castle's most secure messaging hub, where servants could pass information under the cover of hymn singing, their voices rising together while secrets slipped between the lines. Confessionals offered another layer of ingenious deception. A servant might confess to minor sins like laziness or gossip, while actually relaying urgent news to a priest allied with their network. The wooden grills muffled voices just enough to foil listeners outside, and the seal of confession provided ironclad deniability. Some priests actively participated, using absolution rituals to pass along instructions. For your penance, deliver 3 loaves to the poor might really mean burn the letters in the 3rd pantry shelf by dawn. These collaborations weren't just clever, they were borderline blasphemous, turning holy sacraments into covert operations. Yet faith could backfire catastrophically. When a noble needed to dispose of a troublesome servant, accusations of heresy were a nuclear option. A maid seen muttering over herbs might suddenly face witchcraft charges. A groom with unusual scars could be branded a heretic for markings from Satan. Servants walked a razor's edge, leaning into religious displays for protection, but not so fervently that they stood out. The smartest ones studied their master's beliefs meticulously, mirroring the appropriate level of devotion. Serving a devout family, frequent rosary use made you reliable. In a more secular household, overdoing piety might mark you as a potential informant for the church. Food, however, was where servants wielded their most deliciously subtle power. A feast wasn't just a display of wealth, it was a chessboard where every dish carried meaning. The way a platter of roasted swan was angled toward a specific guest could hint at shifting alliances. A servant accidentally oversalting a rival noble's soup wasn't clumsiness. It was a calculated insult disguised as a mistake. Even the timing of courses held significance. Delaying the meat dishes might give a conspirator extra minutes to escape, while serving dessert too early could signal that guards were changing shifts. Kitchens became laboratories of influence. A cook might lace a lord's favorite dish with harmless valerian, ensuring he slept through a critical meeting. Pastry crusts hid more than just meat-folded notes could be baked inside, emerging intact at the table where only the intended recipient would think to check. Spices were particularly potent tools. Saffron's vibrant yellow in a sauce might indicate poison fears, while an excess of pepper could warn of spies in the room. These weren't random choices. They were part of a culinary language understood by everyone from scullions to stewards. The true genius lay in how servants used feasts to manipulate events without leaving fingerprints. A butler might mishear instructions and seat warring factions together, forcing them to make peace publicly or risk appearing petty. Wine stewards developed techniques to water down certain cups, not to save money, but to keep specific nobles just sober enough to avoid disastrous decisions. Even the humblest kitchen boy had power, knowing that a well-timed clang of pots could cover the sound of a conspirator's footsteps. What made food such an effective weapon was its invisibility. Nobles obsessed over the artistry of dishes, never suspecting the messages hidden in their presentation. A sliced pear arranged just so might reveal which castle gates were unguarded. The number of honey cakes on a plate could correspond to days until a planned revolt. Servants turned every meal into a silent dialogue, their mistakes and oversights actually precision strikes in a war no one else realized was being fought. And when tensions reached their peak, the banquet hall became a theater of psychological warfare. A servant clearing plates too quickly might unnerve a guilty noble into confessing. A deliberately spilled goblet could distract the room while evidence vanished. The same hands that prepared feasts to celebrate alliances could subtly arrange place settings to humiliate enemies, seating a proud duke below a low-ranking knight, or serving his meat slightly undercooked as a quiet assertion of disrespect. This culinary chess game reveals the ultimate irony of castle life. While nobles fought with swords and proclamations, servants shaped history through the careful placement of a salt cellar or the strategic timing of a bread basket. Their influence was measured not in battlefield victories, but in who left the table satisfied and who left sweating, wondering how much the staff really knew. The dining hall wasn't just where nobles feasted, it was where servants waged silent wars with every platter they carried. Take the role of the royal taster, a position most assumed was about protecting royalty. In reality, these men were master strategists. A skilled taster didn't just swallow blindly. He knew how to fake hesitation over harmless dishes to make a paranoid lord suspect the wrong rival, or how to subtly press his fingers against a goblet's rim to test for residue before drinking. Some even cultivated reputations for weak stomachs, ensuring that a well-timed illness could derail an entire banquet if they sensed danger. Their job wasn't just to detect poison, it was to weaponize suspicion. Then there were the cooks, the unsung alchemists of the castle. A pinch of nutmeg could mask the bitter tang of hemlock, but in the right hands, that same spice might be used to trigger a noble's known aversion, causing vomiting that would empty the hall at a critical moment. Recipes became coded languages. A venison pie studded with juniper berries might signal safe passage to allies, while an over-salted soup could warn of impending arrest. The kitchen staff's true artistry wasn't in their sauces, but in their ability to make food speak while leaving no evidence of the message. Banquets transformed into psychological battlegrounds. A servant accidentally serving the lord's least favorite wine wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated signal that his power was slipping. The strategic placement of a fish course could imply someone was swimming in dangerous waters, while a custard served too runny might hint at weak alliances. Even the direction in which a platter rotated as it moved down the table carried meaning: clockwise for stability, counter-clockwise for imminent danger. These weren't random choices, they were precision maneuvers disguised as hospitality. Allergies became tools of the trade. A steward who knew his lady couldn't tolerate shellfish might arrange for prawns to accidentally appear near her plate, ensuring she'd retire early with a convincing rash. Other servants exploited medicinal knowledge, adding a harmless herb that turned wine slightly cloudy, making it appear poisoned to nervous nobles. The brilliance lay in the deniability. No laws punished a cook for using thyme instead of rosemary, or a page for forgetting which lord despised almonds. The most dangerous game, the silent escalation between rival households. When one castle's servants started garnishing dishes with edible flowers, a known antidote to certain poisons, it wasn't aesthetics. It was a declaration that they were onto their rival schemes. The response might be a deliberately burnt roast served at the next feast, signaling, "We could have poisoned you, but chose humiliation instead." These culinary duels could last years, with servants as the true generals, maneuvering ingredients like chess pieces. Yet for all their cunning, servants knew the limits. Actual poisoning was rare, too easily traced, too brutal in its consequences. Far safer to make a paranoid duke think he'd been poisoned, watching him sack loyal advisors in his frenzy. A trembling hand serving slightly warm milk could convince a queen her enemies were dosing her with fever inducers, triggering purges of innocent courtiers. The kitchen's real power wasn't in delivering death, but in controlling who feared it and when. This shadow play reached its peak during diplomatic visits. A visiting count might find his favorite childhood dish served perfectly, a seeming kindness, until he realized only someone who'd investigated his wet nurse would know that recipe. Conversely, omitting the traditional salt from bread could imply he wasn't worthy of trust. Every bite carried layers of meaning, with servants as the translators, and sometimes the authors. But food wasn't the only way to exploit noble anxieties. Up next, we'll uncover how servants turned superstition into a weapon, using their master's own beliefs against them. Because in a world where kings feared curses as much as daggers, the right whisper at the right moment could topple thrones. Nobles clutched their rosaries at the sight of a black cat, and servants took notes. A chambermaid might accidentally spill salt near a superstitious lord before battle, knowing he'd delay his march to avoid bad luck. Stable boys learned to whistle certain tunes that sounded like death omens when certain rivals rode past. Every castle had its share of conveniently timed signs, a mirror cracking just as a treasonous plot was hatched, or a servant's vision of a fallen banner preceding a military defeat. These weren't random occurrences, they were psychological operations conducted with medieval precision. Consider the case of a butler in Burgundy who noticed his count feared 13 at table. For weeks before peace negotiations, he made certain exactly 13 place settings appeared whenever the count leaned toward war. The result, a lord so unnerved he acquiesced to terms his servants secretly preferred. Other tactics were more theatrical. A Welsh castle staff famously staged a ghostly apparition by draping wet sheets on a foggy battlement, just as two feuding nobles passed beneath. The sudden ceasefire that followed wasn't supernatural, it was servant-engineered. The real artistry lay in plausible deniability. A gardener didn't plant nightshade near a noble's window to poison them. He let its accidental growth spark fears of witchcraft aimed at rivals. Kitchen staff might shape bread dough into vaguely cross-like forms before church elections, letting pious lords interpret them as divine endorsements. Even children became unwitting actors, taught rhymes that seemed innocent but contained hidden warnings when sung at key moments. These manipulations worked because servants understood an essential truth. The nobility's education made them more susceptible to signs, not less. Where a peasant might shrug off a raven's cry, a Latin-educated lord would recall ominous texts and hesitate. Some servants took it further, maintaining elaborate omen logs, hidden records tracking which superstitions rattled specific nobles. One surviving ledger from York Castle details how Lady Elena would cancel journeys if her left eye twitched, while Baron Geoffrey saw 3 magpies as a death omen. Such archives became powerful tools. A maid consulting her mistress' private log could predict moods with eerie accuracy, timing requests for extra firewood when signs indicated receptiveness. These weren't just tricks, they were survival algorithms refined through generations of observation. The most daring schemes exploited religious fervor. A laundress in Avignon stained a cardinal's robe with rust in a pattern resembling the Virgin's face, knowing the resulting miracle would distract from her allies' heresy trial. In London, servants at the Tower spread rumors of spectral headless queens whenever political prisoners needed sympathy. The line between deception and devotion blurred so completely that some servants began believing their own omens, like the groom who refused to saddle a horse after seeing its shadow move without light. What makes these strategies so fascinating is their lingering influence today. Modern politicians still consult astrologers. Executives avoid certain floors in skyscrapers. The medieval servant's greatest legacy wasn't their tricks, it was proving how easily power bows to perceived patterns. And as we'll see next, they safeguarded these secrets with codes more sophisticated than any noble cipher. Because when your survival depends on hidden knowledge, you don't just remember it, you weave it into the very fabric of daily life. The riskiest secrets weren't whispered, they were written. Imagine a lady's maid crouched by candlelight, her quill scratching symbols only a handful of others could decipher. What looked like a simple household inventory might actually document which nobles were stealing from the treasury, or which bishops' visits coincided with sudden deaths. These coded diaries were more than personal records, they were insurance policies. A steward might bury his journal near the castle midden, ensuring that if he fell from a tower tomorrow, his allies could unearth proof of who ordered it. Others sewn pages into mattress ticking or hollowed out prayer book covers, turning sacred objects into secret archives. The Handmaid's Chronicle remains one of the most revealing survivals. Penned in a mix of Old French and cipher, its margins hold explosive truths like how a queen's miscarriage was actually a carefully staged adoption to secure an heir. The author didn't just record events, she weaponized them. Certain passages are written with iron gall ink that darkens over time, as if the words themselves were waiting to emerge when safe. Others use lemon juice that only appears when heated, a trick learned from apothecaries who used it for invisible wound marks. These weren't naive scribbles, they were tactical deposits of truth timed to outlive their writers. But writing required agonizing choices. A literate servant weighing whether to document a murder plot faced twin horrors, the danger of recording it and the peril of forgetting. Some compromised by crafting dual-purpose texts, a laundry list where each stain described symbolized a noble's vice, or a recipe book where 3 pinches of saffron really meant 3 days until an attack. Poetry proved especially useful, its metaphors providing perfect cover. A verse comparing roses to courtiers might seem flowery until you realized thorns represented armed guards and wilted petals marked traitors. The few surviving diaries reveal how servants shaped history's narrative from below. When King John's tax collectors vanished in Lincolnshire, official records blamed outlaws, but a baker's hidden journal described servants deliberately misdirecting them into quicksand. The peasants' revolt of 1381 wasn't the spontaneous explosion nobles claimed. Brewers' logs show coded meetings in alehouse cellars for months prior. These writers knew their words could rewrite history if they survived. Passing down these records became its own act of rebellion. A mother might teach her daughter to read using a censored Bible, then slip her the real family chronicle at marriage. Some traveling tinkers carried fragments of diaries between castles, stitching them into patchwork narratives only certain eyes could reconstruct. The greatest risk came when servants tried to expose truths in their lifetimes. One Suffolk blacksmith paid a monk to bind his accusations into a church missal, gambling that no noble would thumb through devotional texts. It worked for 50 years until a visiting bishop noticed strange annotations about missing silver. What makes these fragments so extraordinary is their duality. They're both personal cries and political acts, each stroke of the pen a defiance of the idea that servants' lives weren't worth remembering. When we read between their coded lines today, we're not just uncovering secrets, we're witnessing the quietest form of revolution, the refusal to be erased. And then there were the servants who didn't just record history. They manipulated it in real time, nudging kings toward wars or peace with nothing but a well-placed rumor or a strategically spilled cup. Because when you controlled the information flow, you didn't need a crown to rule. Servants didn't just witness history, they orchestrated it from the shadows, their hands guiding events that would later fill history books. Take the infamous fall of Anne Boleyn. While nobles schemed openly, it was her own ladies-in-waiting who provided the damning testimonies about her alleged affairs, some coerced, others calculated. A dropped handkerchief here, a strategically overheard confession there, and suddenly a queen's fate was sealed. Yet these same networks could also protect. When the young princes in the tower vanished, their nurses and tutors likely knew more than they ever admitted. A missing diary, a suddenly recalled errand, a back staircase left unguarded, these weren't accidents. They were choices made by people who understood their loyalty might one day rewrite a kingdom's future. The tools of their trade were deceptively simple. A sewing needle could mend a dress or stitch a hidden compartment into a noble's doublet to hold incriminating letters. A broom leaning against a door wasn't just laziness, it was a signal that the room beyond held secrets worth overhearing. Even something as mundane as a chamber pot became a weapon. Emptied too early, it might force a noble to leave a private meeting for the garderobe at just the right moment for eavesdroppers. Servants turned every object into a potential lever of influence, their mastery of daily routines giving them control over who heard what, when, and how. Consider the power of keys. A chamberlain might carry dozens, each unlocking doors to private chambers, chests of gold, or dungeons. But the real power lay in knowing which keys to lose at critical moments. A missing key could delay a noble's access to damning documents just long enough for allies to flee. Conversely, a duplicate key, accidentally left in a rival's path, might frame them for theft. Key rings weren't just tools, they were chessboards where servants decided which pieces moved and when. Then there were the alibis, a groom swearing his lord was abed all night, a maid recalling a noblewoman's pious prayers during the exact hour a murder occurred. These testimonies could make or break trials. Servants perfected the art of selective memory, offering just enough truth to be credible while omitting the details that mattered. Their words carried weight precisely because they were considered beneath suspicion, their perceived simplicity making them ideal pawns until the moment they chose not to be. The most brilliant manipulations were those that appeared as service. A scribe transcribing a letter might subtly alter a single word, turning a peace offer into an insult. A cupbearer could serve wine in a specific order, ensuring two rivals drank from cups with vastly different alcohol content, one lucid during negotiations, the other slurring and discredited. These weren't grand betrayals, they were microscopic adjustments to reality. each nudging events toward outcomes the powerful never realized were being steered. Perhaps the ultimate irony, many noble triumphs were actually servant inventions. That brilliant diplomatic solution a king claimed credit for, first whispered to him by a valet who'd overheard enemy delegates at the baths. The battle strategy that saved the day, suggested by a blacksmith's apprentice who noticed the enemy's loose horseshoe nails. History remembers the names of rulers, but the gears of power were oiled by hands that left no fingerprints. Hands that understood the most powerful tool of all was letting others believe they were in control. And when those tools failed, servants had one last resort, the carefully timed truth, because nothing toppled thrones faster than a loyal servant suddenly remembering where the bodies were buried. A broom left leaning against a castle wall wasn't just carelessness, it was a signal to allies that the alcove behind it held whispers worth overhearing. Needlework became cartography, with embroidery stitches mapping secret passages in what appeared to be floral patterns. Even a child's spinning top could hide compartments for folded notes, its innocent hum masking treasonous deliveries. Servants transformed the most ordinary items into extraordinary tools, turning their daily chores into acts of espionage right under the noses of the powerful. Take something as simple as a laundry line. The way linens were hung sheets paired with shirts or stockings pinned at specific angles could indicate which gates were lightly guarded or which noble was away from chambers long enough for a search. Kitchen staff developed their own systems, using bread dough to imprint messages before baking. Once eaten, the evidence vanished without a trace. A scullery made scrubbing pots might arrange them in precise formations, their positions corresponding to the number of armed guards in the courtyard. These weren't random acts, they were carefully calibrated communications designed to be invisible to anyone outside the network. Children's toys proved especially ingenious. A doll with removable limbs could hide tiny scrolls in its hollow torso, passed between servants during play. Wooden hobby horses left near doorways signaled safe passage when their heads faced east. Even nursery rhymes were repurposed. A verse about 3 blind mice might actually reference the timing of a guard rotation. The nobility dismissed these items as trivial, never suspecting that the very innocence of play concealed their undoing. But the most dangerous tool of all wasn't an object, it was trust. Servants lived in constant tension between solidarity and suspicion, knowing one loose tongue could unravel years of careful plotting. When betrayal came, it often wore a familiar face, the chambermaid who suddenly wore finer linen, the steward whose son mysteriously got an apprenticeship. These small changes hinted at favors earned by selling secrets. The punishment for treachery was swift and brutal, but rarely overt. A traitor might find their ale mysteriously strengthened until they embarrassed themselves into dismissal, or their boots accidentally filled with burrs that made every step agony. The real genius lay in how servants policed their own without leaving traces. A laundress might stitch a traitor's clothes with subtly itchy thread, ensuring their discomfort grew with each betrayal. Kitchen staff could serve a disloyal colleague extra portions of laxative-laced stew, keeping them too occupied to eavesdrop. These weren't just acts of vengeance, they were precision strikes designed to neutralize threats while maintaining the illusion of harmony. Yet even amidst this silent warfare, loyalty sometimes prevailed. There are accounts of servants taking the blame for crimes they didn't commit to protect allies, or smuggling food to imprisoned comrades despite the risk. Their codes of honor were unwritten but unshakable, forged in the understanding that survival depended on unity. When a servant network functioned at its peak, it moved like a single organism, each part attuned to the others, every mundane object a potential lifeline. And when betrayal did strike, the aftermath revealed the true resilience of these shadow systems. Like a spider repairing a web, servants would reconfigure their codes overnight, abandoning compromised signals, inventing new ones, and always watching for the next knife in the dark. Because in the end, the greatest weapon wasn't hidden in a broom or a doll. It was the collective memory of 100 invisible hands, ready to rewrite the rules the moment they were broken. Betrayal cut deeper than any noble's blade because it came from hands that had once broken bread together. A trusted chambermaid might suddenly start wearing a rival lord's colors, her eyes avoiding old allies. A steward who'd shared stolen wine in the cellars could turn informant overnight, trading years of camaraderie for a promise of freedom. The castle's underbelly thrived on these fractures, servants whispering accusations in dark corridors, leaving cryptic marks on doorframes to signal who could no longer be trusted. The infamous whispering campaigns weren't just rumors, they were psychological sieges. A single question, "Did you hear about the missing silver?" posed just loudly enough in the kitchens could unravel a decade of loyalty by sundown. To survive, servants developed brutal litmus tests. A laundress might deliberately misplace a noble's favorite shirt, then watch who scrambled to cover the mistake, a sign they'd been promised protection. Cooks baked slightly altered recipes for suspected traitors, waiting to see who avoided eating their own portions. Even children were enlisted, taught nursery rhymes with subtle variations. Those who sang the wrong verse revealed they'd been coached by outsiders. The most cunning traps exploited kindness itself. A servant caught stealing medicine for a sick friend might actually be holding counterfeit vials. If the friend recovered too quickly, it proved they had outside resources. When escape became the only option, servants turned their invisibility into a weapon. The smartest fugitives didn't flee at night, they vanished in broad daylight, using routines as camouflage. A gardener might walk out the gates with a wheelbarrow of weeds, its hollowed-out base hiding a scribe's stolen ledger. Kitchen staff exploited funeral processions, blending into mourning crowds with ash-smudged faces and borrowed cloaks. Some even staged their own deaths, like the valet who left his blood-stained tunic by a riverbank, then resurfaced years later as a pilgrim in another kingdom. The most daring escapes relied on noble vanity. A maid serving at a grand banquet could trip, spilling wine on her dress, then slip away while fetching a change of clothes, knowing no lord would notice one less servant in the chaos. Stable hands exploited hunting parties, switching places with decoy dummies lashed to saddles as the group galloped past prearranged hiding spots. These weren't just acts of desperation, they were performances honed through observation, leveraging the noble's belief that servants were interchangeable background figures. For those who couldn't run, disappearing in place was an art form. A butcher might fake illiteracy so thoroughly that when presented with a damning letter, he'd hold it upside down only to later recite every word from memory. Older servants perfected the failing mind act, babbling nonsense when pressed for information, their eyes sharp beneath a veneer of confusion. The castle's hierarchy assumed age-weakened wits, never suspecting it could be the perfect disguise. Yet even the best-laid plans carried heartbreak. Escape often meant leaving behind family, like the baker who needed coded farewells into loaves for his children before fleeing. Others paid crippling bribes, a lifetime's wages for a single night's passage on a smuggler's cart. The cruelest twist, some who escaped physically remained prisoners psychologically, waking for years with phantom pains from whips they'd outrun. Their stories remind us that freedom wasn't just a matter of crossing walls. It was learning to stop glancing over your shoulder. And then there were those who turned the tables entirely, not just escaping but returning as someone new, a pilgrim, a merchant, even a noble's distant relative. Because the ultimate revenge wasn't just surviving, It was walking back through those gates with power they'd been taught never to possess. When the walls of the castle seemed to close in and the risk of discovery became too great, some servants chose the most daring strategy of all, vanishing without a trace. These disappearances were masterclasses in misdirection, where the art of leaving became as carefully choreographed as the art of staying hidden. Take the case of a London steward who staged his own drowning by leaving his cloak and boots by the Thames, then resurfaced weeks later as a scribe in a distant monastery. His meticulous performance included rubbing his own initials from the inside of his belt and planting a forged suicide note quoting scripture, details designed to play on the nobility's superstitions and ensure no one looked for a dead man. Monasteries offered sanctuary in unexpected ways. A fleeing servant might arrive at the gates feigning a sudden religious calling, his hands still rough from castle work, but his voice suddenly full of pious fervor. The smarter ones prepared for years learning Latin phrases from visiting priests, practicing the gait of a penitent, even cultivating a reputation for visions that conveniently excused any gaps in their knowledge. Once inside, they didn't just hide, they thrived. A former kitchen boy with a head for numbers might rise to become the abbey's treasurer, his past erased under the cowl. Traveling troops provided another perfect cover. Minstrels, acrobats, and puppeteers moved between castles with near invisibility, their outsider status making them unmemorable. A groom who'd once mucked stables could reinvent himself as a fire eater, using his knowledge of castle layouts to stage magical disappearances during performances, practicing for the day he'd need to vanish for real. Some troops even operated as secret escape networks, their wagons outfitted with hidden compartments where a fugitive could ride past searching guards. But the most brilliant disappearances exploited noble arrogance. A servant might deliberately get caught stealing a trivial item, a silver spoon, a candle holder, knowing the punishment would be banishment rather than execution. Others staged public breakdowns, feigning madness so convincingly that lords paid to have them removed rather than risk bad luck. One particularly cunning valet even convinced his master he'd contracted leprosy by rubbing his skin with irritating herbs, securing exile to a remote hospital where he promptly recovered and assumed a new identity. Theatrics played a crucial role. A laundress might leave a trail of clothing leading to a riverbank, then double back to hide in the castle's own cellar until the search moved elsewhere. Blacksmiths found weapons to implicate imaginary bandits, while scribes penned fake ransom notes to suggest kidnappings that never occurred. These weren't just escape plans, they were narratives, carefully crafted to steer pursuers toward dead ends while the servant slipped away through the story's cracks. Yet, even in flight, servants left their mark on the world they left behind. A cook might accidentally leave one last coded recipe behind ingredients that, when combined, produced a stench so foul it drove nobles from the castle for days, buying time for allies to destroy evidence. Gardeners planted fast-growing vines to obscure hidden passages, their final act of rebellion blooming long after they'd vanished. These lingering touches reveal the true depth of their artistry, the ability to shape events even in absence. And when these invisible hands finally stepped into the light, they often did so through the very arts their former masters cherished. Because while nobles were busy commissioning tapestries of their triumphs, the people who'd really lived those events were stitching their own truths into the fabric of culture, where a seemingly innocent folktale might just hold the key to a castle's darkest secret. Medieval tapestries show servants as wide-eyed fools tripping over their own feet, and Chaucer's tales paint them as bumbling sidekicks, but these caricatures were the ultimate disguise. A servant leaning into the role of the harmless idiot could linger at keyholes without suspicion, spill wine on a noble's rival without consequences, or mishear instructions in ways that derailed disastrous plans. Art historians often dismiss these depictions as mere comic relief, but look closer. That jug-eared fool in the margin of a manuscript might be shown holding a mirror, not because he's vain, but because he's reflecting secrets back to the viewer. Servants didn't just tolerate these stereotypes, they weaponized them. Take the famous case of Henry V's court jester, officially named Simple John. Chronicles describe him as a drooling simpleton who amused nobles by mispronouncing Latin. Yet treasury records show this same fool received regular payments from foreign ambassadors. Coincidence, or was his gibberish actually coded updates about border tensions delivered in plain sight? The truth lies in the details, like how his trademark floppy had concealed a remarkable ear for languages, or how his clumsy tumbles always seemed to land him near strategic documents. The nobles laughed, but the joke was on them. Literature of the period reveals the same double game. In Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the cook's drunken slurring and the manciple's apparent illiteracy make them seem like buffoons. Yet their stories overflow with thinly veiled critiques of the clergy and nobility, so sharp that modern scholars debate whether Chaucer, who moved in royal circles, could have written them without insider knowledge. The tale's servants aren't just comic relief, they're narrative Trojan horses smuggling subversive truths into entertainment. A pilgrim like the miller, who knew well enough a draught of London ale, likely knew more about tax evasion than he let on. Even religious art played along. Scenes of the Nativity often show shepherds as gaping rubes, but their rough cloaks hide fascinating clues. In one 15th century altarpiece, a shepherd's crooked staff subtly points toward a suspiciously well-dressed angel in the crowd, a possible nod to contemporary scandals of impostors infiltrating monasteries. The message those deemed simple often see clearest. Servants recognized this power, adopting the vacant smiles and shuffling gaits that made nobles underestimate them. A maid who pretended not to understand French could eavesdrop on diplomatic talks. A stable boy who acted terrified of swords might slip one to a rebel under his straw pallet. The financial strategies hidden beneath this performance were masterstrokes of misdirection. A servant paid in gifts rather than wages avoided taxable income, like the laundress who received old gowns too fine for her station, then sold them through third parties. Others exploited noble guilt. After witnessing a lord's crime, a clever valet might decline offered coins, instead requesting, "Just your favor, my lord," a vague debt that could be called in years later for land or titles. The shrewdest operators worked the system from both ends. The baker who overcounted loaves to skim flour for his own black market trade, or the steward who let merchants bribe him for access to the castle, then split the profits with guards to ensure silence. These weren't just survival tactics, they were early forms of wealth redistribution. When a treasurer accidentally recorded a noble's debt as twice the actual amount, the extra might fund a servant's child's education. A butler watering down wine could save enough over a year to buy a peasant family's freedom from serfdom. The records are full of such quiet rebellions, missals with gold leaf carefully scraped off and sold to feed starving villagers, or lost jewels that mysteriously reappeared after a cruel overseer was replaced. What looked like corruption was often justice in disguise, with servants acting as shadow bankers for the oppressed. The ultimate irony, nobles who mocked servants as bad with money were often the worst offenders, running through fortunes on wars and finery while their feckless staff quietly amassed nest eggs. A duke might laugh at his cook's childish habit of counting coins nightly, never realizing those coins included a percentage of his own wasted feasts. The castle's real financial geniuses weren't the treasurers with their ledgers. They were the invisible hands moving gold through pillow seams and hollowed-out loaves, proving that the sharpest minds often hid behind the dumbest mask. Coin was scarce in the servant world, but currency took many forms. A loaf of bread slipped to a guard could buy silence, while knowledge of a noble's secret affair might secure warmer blankets for winter. The real transactions happened in glances and whispers. A laundress trading stained linens to a scribe in exchange for forged letters of recommendation, or a groom promising fast horses to a messenger in return for news from distant towns. Even children participated, their small hands perfect for slipping tokens between adults during market days. This wasn't just barter. It was a finely tuned shadow economy where a single apple could be worth more than gold if delivered to the right hands at the right moment. Some trades required layers of middlemen to avoid detection. A kitchen maid might pass a stolen spice pouch to a stable boy, who'd leave it in a designated hay bale for a blacksmith's apprentice to retrieve and trade to an apothecary's daughter, each link in the chain taking a cut while obscuring the origin. The system thrived on plausible deniability. A chamberlain gifting a scribe extra candles wasn't bribery. It was kindness between colleagues, the scribe's subsequent mistake in recording the lord's debts. Merely an unfortunate error, medicine became one of the most valuable commodities in this underground network. A gardener with knowledge of healing herbs might treat a servant's fever in exchange for extra wool from the weaver's stash. Older women, often dismissed as mere gossips, were actually walking apothecaries, their aprons' pockets stuffed with chamomile for anxiety or yarrow for wounds, traded for favors or protection. Even the castle's cats played their part. Their ability to keep rats from grain stores made them prized assets, with litters of kittens exchanged like precious coins between departments. The true genius of this system was its invisibility. While nobles obsessed over taxes and tariffs, servants operated an entire economy beneath their notice, one where loyalty held more value than silver, and a well-timed favor could mean the difference between starvation and survival. But when illness struck, this hidden network transformed into something far more vital. Because while nobles summoned expensive physicians, servants relied on each other, and their secrets of healing ran deeper than any court doctor's education. Imagine knowing which leaf could ease a noble's fever, or which root, ground fine into his wine, might stop his heart without a trace. Servant healers held this lethal duality in their calloused hands, their aprons' pockets stuffed with petals that could cradle or kill. While castle physicians bled patients with leeches and Latin, these practical chemists worked miracles with moss poultices and fermented honey. A midwife's tincture might ensure a safe birth, or discreetly end an unwanted pregnancy, saving a maid from disgrace. Their power wasn't just in knowledge, but in plausible deniability. After all, who would suspect the gentle herbwoman who'd treated the household's coughs for years? The wise women were particularly vulnerable to this double-edged reputation. Celebrated for curing the countess's migraines one season, they might be dragged to the stake the next when the baron's heir died mysteriously. Their very expertise made them targets, as seen in the tragic case of Matilda of York. Her detailed garden logs recording which flowers bloomed early before plagues first earned her patronage from local lords. But when a rival son perished after her sleep syrup treatment, those same notes became evidence of witchcraft. Servant healers learned to memorize recipes rather than write them, sharing knowledge through songs children could innocently sing. Lavender blue, rosemary green, went one rhyme, its verses encoding antidotes for common poisons. Modern medicine still bears their fingerprints. The aspirin we pop for headaches traces back to willow bark teas servant herbalists brewed for nobles' gout. Digitalis, derived from foxglove, a plant those superstitious old women called elf gloves, now regulates heartbeats in ICUs. Even the concept of quarantine has roots in servant wisdom. Maids noticed nobles who isolated during fevers spread fewer illnesses long before doctors understood contagion. Yet history rarely credits these pioneers, their contributions buried under labels like folk remedy or old wives' tale. The real legacy isn't just in substances but in strategy. Today's hospital hierarchies mirror castle dynamics. Orderlies and nurses, like medieval scullions and chambermaids, often spot critical symptoms first but defer to doctors' authority. The parallel extends to modern whistleblowers who, like servant healers of old, risk their careers to expose dangers those in power overlook. And just as wise women once disguised life-saving advice as harmless gossip, modern aides might frame urgent concerns as casual observations to avoid challenging egos. Perhaps most haunting is how these healers' caution persists in marginalized communities today. Immigrant grandmothers still hesitate to share traditional remedies, fearing accusations of backwardness. Herbalists balance between TikTok fame and FDA scrutiny, just as their ancestors navigated between noble patronage and heresy charges. The line between healer and poisoner remains perilously thin. Only now, the stakes are lawsuits instead of pyres. Yet in emergency rooms and war zones alike, where formal medicine fails, people still turn to those with hands-on wisdom. Because when lives hang in the balance, sometimes the most advanced solution is the one whispered centuries ago by a servant who knew roses weren't just for beauty. Their hips could stave off scurvy, and their thorns could deliver a toxin no lord would taste until it was too late. Medieval servants may have vanished from castle corridors centuries ago, but their survival strategies still whisper through modern hallways. Just swap torches for fluorescent lights and goblets for coffee cups. That corporate intern who remembers everyone's coffee order, she's using the same subtle observation skills as a lady's maid noting which nobles took honey in their wine. The IT technician who accidentally overhears boardroom conversations while fixing the projector. He's channeling the stable boys who memorized battle plans while brushing down horses. These invisible players hold power precisely because no one thinks to watch them, a truth as potent in Silicon Valley as it was in Versailles. Take the concept of plausible deniability, a term spies cherish but servants invented. When a medieval laundress misplaced a damning letter, she left no fingerprints, just like today's administrative assistant who forgets to forward an incriminating email. The tools have changed, but the dance remains identical. Influence without accountability, impact without visible effort. Even modern cybersecurity mirrors servant networks. Encrypted messages are just digital versions of herbs tied in specific knots to convey warnings, while firewalls function like castle portcullises, selectively filtering who gains access to the kingdom's secrets. The legacy cuts deeper than workplace dynamics. Intelligence agencies still train operatives in techniques servants perfected centuries ago. A CIA manual on dead drops, hidden locations to pass information, could have been written by medieval scullions who left notes under loose hearthstones. The brush pass, where spies exchange items during a brief contact, that's a direct descendant of servants bumping shoulders in crowded halls, trading folded parchment between palm touches. Even the concept of need-to-know information hierarchies originated in castles, where a chamberlain might share secrets with the steward but not the stable hand, until the stable hand proved his loyalty by correctly interpreting which bale hid a message. Yet for all their sophistication, servants endured two stubborn myths. First, that they were powerless. History loves underdog stories, but only if they stay underdogs. The truth is messier. Servants exercised real influence just quietly. A modern parallel, the myth that receptionists or janitors are just support staff, despite often knowing more about office dynamics than the CEO. Second, the idea that servants were universally loyal. In reality, their alliances shifted like sand, exactly like today's workplace, where today's confidant might be tomorrow's rival. The difference: medieval servants rarely had the luxury of burning bridges. When your survival depends on your oppressor's whims, you learn to extinguish conflicts with silence, not confrontations. The most enduring myth, though, is that their world was simpler. They just cooked and cleaned, the thinking goes, ignoring the mental gymnastics required to navigate a single day in service. Imagine juggling a noble's ego, a rival's plot, and a co-worker's blackmail attempt, all while needing dough for the morning bread. Modern employees facing office politics might recognize that particular exhaustion. The difference: today's missteps might cost you a promotion. For servants, they could cost fingers, or worse. Perhaps their greatest gift to us isn't a specific tactic, but a mindset, the art of strategic patience. Servants knew storms pass, tyrants fall, and fortunes shift, and those who watched, learned, and adapted survived to shape what came next. In an age of viral outrage and knee-jerk reactions, that lesson alone could rewrite playbooks from boardrooms to governments. Because the real masters of the game have always been those who understand visibility is optional, but influence is eternal. Now, let's peel back another layer of myth. Were servants truly as silent as history suggests? The answer lies in the spaces between official records where laughter, grief, and rebellion were recorded not in ink, but in the wear patterns of castle stones and the stains left on long-forgotten aprons. Hollywood loves its tropes: the downtrodden servant with trembling hands, the cackling villain who sharpens knives in the shadows. But peel back the layers of cinematic fantasy, and you'll find a truth far more compelling. Medieval servants were neither saints nor monsters. They were human beings navigating an impossible tightrope, their choices shaped by hunger, fear, loyalty, and sometimes quiet rebellion. Take the classic evil maidservant trope, the woman who poisons her mistress out of jealousy. In reality, a maid might slip herbs into a noble's wine not out of malice, but because his death would protect her own family from his violent whims. Survival rarely fit into neat moral boxes. Consider the myth of servants as passive bystanders to history. Films show them cowering in corners during great events, but records tell a different story. When King Richard II was deposed, it was his own chamber valets who smuggled out his personal letters, ensuring future generations would hear his side. During the Peasants' Revolt, cooks and stable hands didn't just join the mob, they guided it, using their knowledge of castle weak points to breach walls. These weren't mindless followers, they were strategic actors with stakes in the outcome. Then there's the persistent idea that servants were universally loyal to their masters. The truth was far messier. A nurse might genuinely love the noble child she raised, yet still sell information about the family's finances to pay her brother's debts. A blacksmith could take pride in crafting a lord's sword while secretly dulling the blade so it would fail in battle. Loyalty was a currency traded in increments, a day's wages for silence, a month's protection for a well-timed warning. Servants understood what modern workplaces still grapple with. Allegiance is conditional, and survival sometimes means wearing multiple masks. Perhaps the most damaging myth is that servants lacked agency. We imagine them as chess pieces moved by nobles, but in reality, they were players in their own right. A scribe might mishear a command to execute prisoners, buying time for appeals. A laundress could lose the shirt a lord planned to wear for a duel, delaying the confrontation until tempers cooled. these weren't accidents, they were deliberate interventions, tiny acts of defiance that altered outcomes without ever appearing on historical record. What's lost in the caricatures is their profound humanity, the way a scullion might save scraps to feed stray dogs, or how a steward wept privately after evicting tenants, knowing his own survival depended on following orders. Their lives were a mosaic of contradictions, cruelty and kindness, complicity and resistance, all woven together by the unrelenting pressure of their world. To reduce them to stereotypes does more than distort history. It erases the ingenuity, resilience, and moral complexity of people who shaped empires from the shadows. The next time you see a servant in a film or novel, ask yourself, what's the story they aren't telling? Because behind every silent figure in the background, there was a person who laughed, schemed, loved, and fought not as a plot device, but as a human being trying to survive. Beneath the coded messages and strategic silences, medieval servants carried the weight of emotions as heavy as castle stones. A rare surviving letter from a chambermaid in Normandy speaks of nights spent pressing her face into straw pallets to muffle sobs, her grief for an executed friend too dangerous to voice aloud. Another, scribbled in the margins of a prayer book by a stable hand, confesses his terror each time he adjusted a noble's stirrups, knowing a loose strap could send him to the gallows if the rider fell. These weren't just players in a game of intrigue. They were people who loved, feared, and dreamed in the shadows. The emotional landscape of service was a minefield of contradictions. A nursemaid might rock a noble's child to sleep with genuine tenderness, while silently resenting the infant who would grow to wield power over her own children. Cooks stirred cauldrons with hands calloused from labor, yet their songs passed down through generations held coded lyrics about rivers that could carry them far from castle walls. Even laughter came layered. Servants developed a distinctive court giggle, just loud enough to flatter nobles' jokes but never hearty enough to draw attention to their own joy. Personal attachments between servants often ran deeper than blood. Isolated from birth families, many formed bonds closer than kinship, like the trio of laundresses in York who shared a single winter cloak, taking turns to wear it during pre-dawn washings. These relationships weren't just comforts, they were lifelines. When one servant fell ill, others would take on extra work to cover their absence, a dangerous generosity, since weakness invited dismissal. Some even risked their lives to protect friends, like the scribe who burned his own hand on a candle to disguise another's ink-stained fingers from a suspicious lord. Hope flickered in unexpected places. Servants marked time not by royal decrees but by personal milestones. The day a kitchen boy earned his first whole coin, the moment a lady's maid was entrusted with keys to the jewel chest. Tiny rebellions nourished their spirits. A groom might let a favorite horse gallop free one last time before selling it, or a scullion save rose petals from banquet centerpieces to press into makeshift books. These acts weren't just defiance, they were declarations of selfhood in a world that sought to erase them. The cruelest emotional toll came from forced complicity. A steward ordered to evict starving tenants, a maid compelled to dress her mistress for an arranged marriage, their hands carried out actions their hearts condemned. Some left haunting traces of this inner conflict, like the valet's diary discovered in Burgundy, where every entry about whipping prisoners was written in increasingly frantic script before ending mid-sentence, as if he couldn't bear to finish the memory. Others developed rituals to cleanse their consciences, like the baker who secretly added an extra loaf to the poor box for every unjust order he obeyed. Yet resilience blossomed in these cracks. Servant networks functioned as emotional support systems centuries before the term existed. Older staff taught young recruits mental survival techniques, focusing on pleasant textures during abuse, or imagining their tormentors as braying donkeys to rob them of power. Shared stories became psychological armor. Tales of clever foxes outwitting wolves mirrored their own struggles, offering hope that brains could triumph over brute strength. Even seemingly mundane traditions, like passing a single cherished comb through generations of maids, served as tactile reminders that their lives held value beyond service. These emotional legacies were preserved through astonishing ingenuity. A seamstress in Lincolnshire stitched her life story into the lining of a tapestry, her tiny embroidered figures showing scenes no noble would ever notice. A butler in Gascony etched his memoir onto the underside of silver platters, knowing the reflections would keep his words hidden until some future hand polished at just the right angle. Most poignant are the children's toys found in castle ruins: a doll with a face carved from a peach pit, a wooden horse with frayed string reins, each whispering that even in darkness, the human impulse to love and create could never be fully extinguished. Their stories didn't vanish when they died. They seeped into the stones they polished, the bread they kneaded, the very air of castles now visited by tourists who unknowingly walk paths worn smooth by invisible feet. What remains isn't just records of survival, but testaments to the quiet courage of ordinary people who refused to let their hearts turn to stone, even when the world insisted they were made of nothing more than dust and duty. And now, as we trace how these fragile fragments endured against all odds, we'll uncover the surprising allies who ensured servants' voices weren't lost to time. From sympathetic monks to rebellious scribes who risked everything to make sure history remembered more than just the names of kings. History rarely writes itself in straight lines, especially for those who weren't meant to be remembered. But if you know where to look, the whispers of medieval servants still echo through time. Take something as ordinary as a household ledger from 14th century Paris. On the surface, it's just columns of grain purchases and candle expenses. But squint closer, and you'll spot the erratic handwriting where a steward recorded extra flour sacks every full moon, likely covering for bakers feeding runaway serfs. These weren't mistakes, they were deliberate breadcrumbs left for future eyes. Archaeologists have turned servant quarters into treasure hunts for hidden defiance. Beneath floorboards at Warwick Castle, they found a child's doll stuffed with rosemary, not for play, but to mask the scent of a stolen prayer book sewn into its belly. At Dover, a loose stone concealed a charcoal drawing of a hanged man with a noble's distinctive beard, a silent indictment someone risked their life to preserve. Even the walls themselves tell stories. Infrared scans at a Burgundian chateau revealed finger-smudged tallies near hearths, where scullions likely counted days until their contracts ended. Folk songs became covert history books. The cheerful-sounding Broomfield Hill ballad about a maid outsmarting a knight. Scholars now believe it encoded real escape routes, the hill representing a specific forest path where servants vanished during harvest time. Meanwhile, church trial records expose heartbreaking strategies. One laundress in Rouen testified through tears that she'd pretended not to understand French for 15 years to avoid being interrogated about her mistress's affairs. Her performance was so convincing, the judges dismissed her as simple, exactly as she'd planned. Some of the most revealing finds aren't grand artifacts, but the humblest objects. A rusted thimble from York shows tiny teeth marks along its rim, likely gnawed by a seamstress straining to stay awake during all-night sewing emergencies. A pewter spoon bent at a precise 45-degree angle could have been used to measure medicinal doses or poison. Even animal bones tell tales. Butchered hare remains found in a London castle servant cellar suggest someone was supplementing meager rations with forbidden game, risking flogging for a taste of protein. The true revelation isn't just what survived, but why. Servants chose their legacy carefully. They hid messages in objects meant to outlast parchment, carving grievances into the undersides of choir stalls, stitching symbols into tapestries' reverse sides. At Eltham Palace, conservators found a servant's entire life story etched into the lead lining of a stained glass window, names of lost children, dates of unjust beatings, even a crude map to a hidden garden where medicinal herbs grew. This wasn't vanity, it was resistance. They knew stone and glass would endure when paper burned. Modern technology is cracking their codes wide open. Multispectral imaging can now detect erased servant names from noble family trees. DNA analysis of ancient lice combs reveals which workers shared beds despite strict segregation rules. Even AI is helping reconstruct songs from fragments of lyrics preserved in tavern ledgers, giving voice to melodies once hummed only in cellar kitchens. Each discovery peels back another layer of the intricate, invisible world that kept castles running and occasionally brought them crashing down. What emerges isn't just a collection of artifacts, but a radical rethinking of power. These fragments prove servants weren't passive witnesses to history. They were its archivists, using whatever means they had to ensure the truth wouldn't die with them. A scratched message on a pewter plate, a braid of hair tucked into a wall, all were declarations that their lives mattered. And now, centuries later, we're finally learning to read their language. The real lesson: history isn't just written by the winners. Sometimes it's whispered by the people who polished their silver. Centuries of silent observation taught medieval servants something we've largely forgotten: the extraordinary power of restraint. In our world of constant updates and compulsive sharing, their ability to hold a secret feels almost radical. Every dropped handkerchief, every strategically placed candle wasn't just about survival. It was a masterclass in how much can be communicated without uttering a word. Modern workplaces could learn volumes from the chambermaid who knew when to feign deafness during private conversations, or the scribe who left just enough space between lines of text for truths to hide in plain sight. Their discretion wasn't weakness, it was precision engineering of influence. Adaptability was their lifeline, flowing through their strategies like water reshaping itself around stone. A servant transferred between castles didn't just learn new routines, they deciphered fresh dialects of silence, where a napkin folded in Lyon might mean safety while the same fold in London signaled danger. This mental agility puts our modern resistance to change in stark relief. Imagine rebooting your entire communication system overnight because someone overheard a code phrase, yet they did it routinely, treating adaptation not as crisis but as craft. The stable boy who noticed a noble spur was loose didn't just fix it. He read it as a clue about rushed departures and unstable alliances, adjusting his own plans before the first horse was saddled. What's most humbling is how they turned supposed weaknesses into strengths. Being overlooked became their superpower, their invisibility, allowing them to witness truths the powerful never noticed. Today's surveillance cameras would baffle them, not because they couldn't grasp the technology, but because they'd wonder why anyone would need devices when simple awareness of human patterns revealed so much. The kitchen maid who knew a lord was lying by how his fingers tapped his goblet didn't need facial recognition software. She had something far more powerful: attention honed by necessity. Yet their greatest lesson isn't about secrecy, it's about patience. Servants understood that some truths must ripen before being picked, that exposing a plot too soon was as dangerous as missing it entirely. In our era of hot takes and instant reactions, their willingness to wait years for the perfect moment to act feels almost alien. The laundress who slowly unraveled a rival's embroidery to delay her wedding, the groom who subtly redirected a warhorse's training over months to favor its left side. these weren't impulsive acts, but symphonies of delayed impact conducted with breathtaking discipline. So here's the question they leave echoing through time. In a world that equates visibility with value, what might we be overlooking by refusing to disappear? The servant's legacy suggests that real influence often lies not in trending louder, but in listening closer, not in accumulating followers, but in mastering the art of being forgotten at just the right moment. After all, the people who truly shaped history weren't always the ones holding the scepters. Sometimes they were the ones who knew exactly when to look the other way. The unseen servants of medieval courts didn't just survive, they rewrote the rules of power from the shadows. While kings and queens strutted across history's stage, these invisible players perfected an art far more subtle than swordplay, the delicate science of influence without recognition. Their true weapon wasn't stealth or silence, it was understanding that in a world obsessed with who held the crown, real control often lay with those who polished it. Consider the paradox of their existence. Servants were simultaneously indispensable and expendable, trusted with state secrets yet dismissed as furniture. This contradiction became their greatest advantage. A valet dressing his lord might accidentally let a damning letter slip from the man's doublet during an audience with rivals. A laundress folding linens could spend years subtly starching a noble's collars too stiff, knowing the discomfort would make him snappish during critical negotiations. Their power didn't come from defiance, but from the precise calibration of obedience, following orders just poorly enough to steer events, just well enough to avoid suspicion. What makes their legacy so enduring isn't just their cunning, but the universal truths they reveal about human nature. The fear of being overlooked, servants transformed it into a superpower. The instinct to shout when ignored, they mastered the louder language of strategic silence. Even their coded systems, from herb gardens planted with hidden meanings to the rhythmic clatter of dishes signaling danger, speak to a profound truth. When you're denied a voice, you learn to make the ordinary extraordinary. A dropped spoon isn't just a spoon, it's a warning. A crooked candle isn't careless, it's a lifeline. Their stories resonate today because we all navigate versions of their world. That coworker who forgets to schedule the toxic manager's meetings, the barrister who remembers your usual before you speak, they're playing the same ancient game of quiet influence. Medieval servants remind us that hierarchy is an illusion. Real power flows to those who control the gears, not just the levers. The scribe holding the pen shapes the treaty as much as the king signing it. The maid who decides which letters go missing holds more sway than the duke who wrote them. So the next time you feel small in a system that seems rigged against you, remember the scullion who outmaneuvered an empire with nothing but a broom and keen eyes. Your greatest strength might not be in demanding attention, but in mastering what others overlook. Because history isn't just made by those who claim credit, it's shaped by those who know when to disappear. Now we turn to you. If you'd walked those candlelit corridors, what subtle code would have been your signature move? A strategically spilled goblet, a prayer book left open to a telling verse. Drop your survival strategies below, and let's keep unraveling these hidden threads of history together. And if you've ever felt like the invisible hand behind the scenes, share your story. You're part of a tradition far older than you might realize. Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the overlooked corners of the past, where the quietest voices often hold the most explosive